41,000 feet over the Rockies when my daughter's voice nearly broke me in half. It was a Tuesday in late October. I'd been in Portland for a 4-day forensic accounting conference, the kind where you sit in fluorescent-lit hotel ballrooms and argue about audit trails while drinking bad coffee. I turned off airplane mode somewhere over Nevada, just killing time before we landed in Denver for a layover. I had maybe 37 emails, a voicemail from my office, and one message in the family app. My daughter Nora and I used to stay in touch. She was 11. She was supposed to be at my brother-in-law's place in Flagstaff. The message wasn't a text. It was a video, 43 seconds long, filmed in near darkness. I almost didn't press play. I almost scrolled past it. I thought maybe she'd sent me a funny clip of the dog or a photo of whatever project she'd been working on. Instead, I put in one earbud, tapped the screen, and heard my daughter crying. "Dad," her voice was barely there, this thin, terrified whisper. "Dad, I don't know if you're going to see this. Uncle Terrence took my phone 2 days ago. I found Aunt Gwen's old iPad in the storage room. I have to be really quiet." She stopped, and I heard her trying to control her breathing, trying not to sob. "I'm in the storage room, the one downstairs. I've been in here since Friday because I spilled paint on the carpet in the guest room and Aunt Gwen got really, really mad. She said I had to think about what I did." She stopped again. "Dad, it's been 4 days, maybe 5. They brought me a sandwich yesterday. Before that, I don't think there was a long pause. I don't think it was since Friday. I'm really thirsty. I tried to be good. I don't understand why they're so angry. Please, please come get me. Please." The video cut out. I sat there in 24B and I couldn't breathe. The man next to me was watching a movie. The flight attendant was pushing a cart down the aisle. The whole cabin was quiet and ordinary, and my daughter was locked in a basement in Arizona. I need to back up and explain how she ended up there, because that matters. My wife Diane died 2.5 years ago, pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks, which meant I spent most of that time still hoping. She was 40 years ago. Nora had just turned 9. What I can tell you about that period is that it rewires you. Things that used to feel important stopped mattering. Things I'd taken for granted. Her voice in the kitchen in the morning, the way she folded dish towels a particular way, became the things I missed most. I am a forensic accountant. I investigate financial fraud for a living. Insurance companies, law firms, corporate clients. I work long hours. I travel for conferences and depositions, and I've been doing it for 15 years. After Diane died, I had to restructure everything. Nora goes to school 3 blocks from my office in Albuquerque. We have a routine. I'm home by 6 most days. Her grandmother watches her when I travel, but Diane's mother had a hip replacement in September, and she was still recovering. So when this conference came up, and attendance was basically mandatory, my firm sends 1 senior analyst every year. I had to find an alternative. My sister-in-law Gwen and her husband Terrence offered immediately. They live in Flagstaff, about 4.5 hours from us. They have a nice house, a big yard, a golden retriever that Nora adores. Gwen is Diane's younger sister. She'd been attentive during Diane's illness, had come to stay with us for a week right after the funeral. She cried harder than anyone at the graveside, and I remember being grateful for that, thinking at least someone else understood how enormous the loss was. Terrence is a contractor. He runs a mid-size renovation company. He's quiet, not unfriendly, just the kind of person who doesn't take up much space in a room. I'd always assumed that was just his personality. Nora had been excited to go. They have a pool. She and Gwen had what seemed like a warm relationship. I dropped her off on a Thursday afternoon, and Nora ran toward the dog before I even got her bag out of the trunk. I spoke to her twice while I was gone. Both times Gwen called, put her on for a couple of minutes. She said everything was fine. She sounded a little tired, but fine. Gwen said she was having a great time but exhausted from all the fresh air. That was a lie, and Gwen had made sure Nora couldn't tell me otherwise. I watched that 43-second video 4 times at 41,000 feet, and then I stopped watching it because I needed to be able to function. My hands were shaking badly enough that I kept mistyping the passcode. I got into my phone eventually and called Nora's number, straight to voicemail, called Gwen, no answer, called Terrence, no answer. Then I called my wife's mother, even though she was recovering from surgery, because she was the only person I knew who would understand the gravity of what I was about to say. She picked up on the second ring. My mother-in-law is 72 years old, and she had been sitting in a recliner in Tucson for 6 weeks with a surgical drain. When I played her the video over the phone, she was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "I'm calling the Flagstaff police right now." I said, "You're recovering from surgery." She said, "I can make a phone call from a recliner. Give me the address." I gave her the address. Then I called 911 myself and explained the situation. The dispatcher was calm. She asked for Nora's age, her description, the exact address, whether I had a custody order or guardianship documentation. I didn't have a custody order because I was her father and she was my child, and I had left her with family voluntarily. I sent the dispatcher the video. She told me officers would respond immediately, that she was dispatching right now, and to stay on the line. My layover in Denver was 2 hours. My flight to Albuquerque was at 8:40. That was another 4.5 hours minimum before I could get in the car and drive to Flagstaff. I went to the United desk and asked about earlier flights to Phoenix or Flagstaff. There was a 7:15 to Phoenix with 2 seats open. I paid $380 on my card without blinking and ran to the gate. The flight to Phoenix was 2 hours. I don't remember most of it. I called Gwen 7 more times. I called Terrence 5 more times. No answer from either. I called my mother-in-law back and she told me Flagstaff PD had confirmed they were at the address. She was crying, this quiet, controlled crying that was somehow worse than shouting would have been. She said they're there. They found her. She's alive. She's okay. She's okay. She's okay. But she wasn't okay. That's the thing I want to be clear about. I rented a car at Sky Harbor and drove 93 miles to Flagstaff in just under an hour and 15 minutes. There was a police cruiser still in the driveway when I arrived, and an ambulance, lights off, parked at the curb. I saw it from the end of the block and I went cold all over. An officer met me at the end of the driveway. I told him who I was before he could say anything. He took me inside and through the kitchen and down a hallway to a room where a second officer was sitting next to Nora on a couch. She was wrapped in a wool blanket that was too big for her. Someone had given her a juice box and she was holding it with both hands. When she saw me, she made a sound I will never forget for the rest of my life. It wasn't words, it was just sound. She launched herself off that couch and I caught her and held on. She kept saying, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to spill the paint. I tried to clean it up. I'm sorry." I kept saying, "You have nothing to be sorry for. You did nothing wrong. I've got you. I'm here." The EMT told me she was dehydrated and hadn't eaten properly in at least 48 hours. Her lips were cracked. She had a bruise on her shin from where she'd fallen in the dark trying to find the bathroom in the storage room. They hadn't given her a working flashlight. They took her to Flagstaff Medical Center, and I rode with her in the ambulance. In the car, she would not let go of my hand. She kept asking if we had to go back to their house. I told her no. I told her we would never go back there. Gwen and Terrence had been home the entire time. They were in the living room when the police arrived. Terrence told the officers that Nora had been given a timeout for property destruction and that this was a private parenting decision and that as her temporary guardians they had the authority to discipline her as they saw fit. Gwen said Nora was dramatic and prone to exaggerating. The property destruction was a square of carpet, maybe 18 inches across, with a watercolor smear on it. I saw the photo the officer took of it. It looked like something you'd wipe up with a damp cloth. They put my 11-year-old daughter in a basement for 5 days because she accidentally got paint on a carpet. At the hospital, they kept Nora overnight for observation. The doctor said she was severely dehydrated, malnourished enough to be concerning for a 5-day period, and showing signs of acute stress response. Her blood pressure was elevated. She flinched when a male nurse walked in too quickly. The pediatric social worker on call came and spoke with her while I sat outside in the hallway and stared at the ceiling tiles for 40 minutes. Detective Ruiz introduced herself to me around midnight. She was matter-of-fact, efficient, the kind of person who delivers hard information without softening it so much it stops meaning anything. She told me Gwen and Terrence had been taken in for questioning. She told me their statements were inconsistent. She told me she needed mine. I gave it to her, all of it. How I dropped Nora off Thursday. How Gwen had managed every phone call and kept them short. How I'd had no indication anything was wrong until I watched that video somewhere over Nevada. Then Detective Ruiz said something that made the bottom drop out of my chest. She said, "Mr. Calloway, we contacted Child Protective Services as a matter of protocol, and in the process of that contact, we found a prior report." I asked her what that meant. She said, 3 years ago, a 7-year-old boy in Gwen and Terrence's extended social network, the son of a family they'd hosted for a weekend, was kept in a garage for an afternoon as punishment for breaking a window. The family filed a complaint, but withdrew it. No charges were filed. I stared at her. She said there's a second incident. A 13-year-old niece on Terrence's side 5 years ago, she was left in a car overnight in July. Terrence claimed it was accidental. CPS investigated and closed the case. The family declined to pursue it. 2 prior incidents. Both families had been paid off quietly or had backed down, and no one had flagged Gwen and Terrence as a risk. No one had stopped them from volunteering to take my daughter. I sat in that hospital hallway for a long time after Detective Ruiz left. I want to be honest about what I was feeling because I think sometimes in these stories, the father is described as calm and tactical and righteous from the start. I wasn't any of those things. For the first 24 hours, I was barely functional. I sat next to Nora's hospital bed and watched her sleep, and I thought about the fact that she had been in that basement while I was sitting in a hotel ballroom debating audit methodologies, and the rage I felt was so physical it was almost like nausea. I had to step outside twice to stop myself from driving back to Gwen and Terrence's house and doing something I would regret. What got me through it was Nora needing me present. She woke up twice in the night, and both times she reached for my hand before she was fully conscious. That pull, her needing to verify I was still there, it kept me in the room. It kept me sitting down. Gwen and Terrence were charged 3 days later. False imprisonment of a child, child abuse, and child endangerment. The DA's office told me they were pursuing it aggressively, given the prior incident pattern. Their defense, delivered through an attorney within the week, was that this was a cultural misunderstanding about discipline methods, that Nora had been difficult and destructive, that the storage room had adequate ventilation and was not intended to cause harm. The attorney used the phrase reasonable temporary confinement. I am a forensic accountant. I find money people have tried to hide. I have been doing it for 15 years, and I am very good at it, and when I decided to put those skills to work, I was thorough. I started with Terrence's contracting company. He operated under the name Ridgeline Renovation, based in Coconino County. I pulled his business filings, his contractor's license records, his permits. What I found took about 4 days to put together. Terrence had been double billing clients. He'd run the same materials invoices through multiple jobs, charging different homeowners for the same lumber, the same fixtures, the same subcontractor fees. Over roughly 6 years, the amount added up to somewhere between $190,000 and $240,000, depending on how conservatively you estimated the duplications. He'd also been paying a portion of his personal expenses through the business, car payments, home renovations, a vacation to Cabo as deductible business costs. I compiled a detailed report and sent it to the Arizona Registrar of Contractors, the Arizona Department of Revenue, and the IRS. I included the specific invoice numbers, the client names, the dates, the dollar amounts. I included a summary of how the scheme worked in plain English so no one would have to be an accountant to understand it. Then I looked at Gwen. Gwen ran a small event planning business out of Flagstaff, mostly weddings and corporate retreats. She had a reasonable reputation locally. I looked at her business reviews, her vendor relationships, her social media presence, the public-facing version of her life, and then I looked at the contracts she'd filed with Coconino County for venue permits. She'd been inflating venue costs on client invoices and pocketing the difference. A venue charges $3,000. She bills the client $4,800 and keeps the $1,800. I found 16 instances going back 4 years. It wasn't a massive fraud, but it was consistent and deliberate. I sent that to the Arizona Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division, along with copies of the original venue invoices and the client billing records, which I obtained through a contact at one of the venues who had no idea what Gwen had been doing with the numbers. I also contacted every family who had sent a child through any event or program that Gwen and Terrence had ever hosted or supervised. I didn't editorialize. I sent them a link to the public court records showing the charges and a brief factual summary of what had happened to my daughter. I let them decide what to do with it. Within 6 weeks, Gwen's event planning business had no active bookings. 3 former clients filed small claims actions against her for the invoice discrepancies. 2 of Terrence's largest clients terminated their contracts and demanded refunds. The Arizona Registrar suspended his contractor's license pending investigation. Their attorney tried to contact me twice. I didn't respond. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do any of this out of spite, or at least not only out of spite. I did it because these were not people who had made a single terrible mistake in a moment of anger. They had done this before. They had done it to children who couldn't protect themselves, and the adults who should have held them accountable had been paid off or intimidated into silence. If I had done nothing, they would have done it again to someone else's child because they had always gotten away with it. The trial happened 8 months after Nora was found. By then, Terrence's contractor's license had been formally revoked. Gwen had declared bankruptcy. They had sold the Flagstaff house, which had been heavily mortgaged, and were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Mesa. The prosecution called Detective Ruiz, the ER doctor who had treated Nora, the pediatric social worker, and representatives from both prior incident families who finally agreed to testify after years of silence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Gwen received 7 years. Terrence received 4. The sentencing judge noted that the pattern of behavior across multiple children and multiple years indicated this was not a lapse in judgment, but a character. He used that word, character. I wrote it down. They were ordered to pay restitution covering Nora's medical expenses and an amount toward the cost of her ongoing therapy. They don't have the money to pay it, and they never will. My ex-wife's mother wept when I called her with the verdict. She's been Nora's most consistent presence outside of me, calling every Sunday, driving up from Tucson every few months, sitting at Nora's robotics meets and science fairs with a hand-lettered sign like she's at a professional sporting event. She told me Diane would be proud of how I handled it. I don't know if that's true. I'd like to believe it. Nora is 13 now. She has a therapist she trusts, a woman named Dr. V, who Nora describes as extremely no-nonsense, which apparently is the highest compliment she can give. She still doesn't like being in rooms without windows. She still gets nervous when I travel, and she calls me twice a day when I'm gone, once in the morning and once before bed. I always pick up. If I'm in a meeting, I step out. She needs to hear my voice, and she will have it every time she needs it, for as long as she needs it. The nightmares were bad for the first year. She'd wake up convinced she was back in the storage room, that the door was locked, that no one was coming. I'd sit on the edge of her bed and we'd count things in her room out loud. The books on the shelf, The trophies from robotics, the photos on the corkboard, until she remembered where she was. It happened less often now. Once a month maybe. Sometimes less. She doesn't talk about Gwen much. When she does, she uses her first name, which she started doing without my prompting, as if using a relational title, aunt, would give the woman something she hadn't earned back. A few months ago, we were driving home from a science competition. Nora's team had placed second, and she was in that post-competition state where she talks about everything and nothing at once. She'd been quiet for about 10 minutes, and then she said, out of nowhere, "Do you ever feel bad about what you did to them?" To Gwen and Terence. I thought about how to answer honestly. I said, "Do you want the actual answer?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "No. I found out what they'd done before you, and if I'd looked the other way, they would have done it to another kid. Everything I did to make sure that didn't happen. Does it bother you that I feel that way?" She looked out the window for a while. Then she said, "No, I think it's fair. I used to feel like it was my fault, like if I hadn't spilled that paint, none of it would have happened. But my therapist keeps reminding me that people like Gwen will always find a reason. The paint was just the excuse." "Your therapist is right," I said. She said, "I know, I just needed to hear it enough times before I believed it." We drove without talking for a while. Then she said, "I knew you'd come. Even when I didn't know if the video sent. Even when the tablet died before I could check. I still knew you would come." I had to keep my eyes on the highway for a minute before I could answer. I said, "I will always come. You understand that? It doesn't matter where I am. If you call me, I will come." She nodded, and I saw her smile a little, looking out at the dark road ahead. There's something people ask me sometimes, now that the case has been covered locally and a few people in the forensic accounting community know the story. They ask whether I think what I did to Gwen and Terence's finances and reputation crossed a line, whether I took it too far. I've thought about that question seriously, and what I keep coming back to is this. They chose to put my daughter in a locked room for 5 days when she was 11 years old and recently motherless. They knew she had lost her mother. Gwen knew. She'd been at the funeral. She had held Nora at the graveside, and then she locked her in a basement over a patch of watercolor on a carpet. I don't think I took it far enough. I think the fact that they had done this to other children before Nora and faced no real consequence is an indictment of every adult who had known and stayed quiet. I was the first one who didn't. Nora is in 8th grade. She wants to study biomedical engineering. She says she wants to build prosthetics, devices that give people back something they've lost. I don't know where she got that. Maybe from her mother, who was a physical therapist and spent her career helping people rebuild what injury had taken. Maybe just from being Nora. Last week she showed me the outline for a personal essay she's writing for a gifted program application. It's about the concept of proof, how scientists establish that something is true, how you verify what you cannot directly observe. She didn't mention the basement. The essay is entirely about scientific methodology, but I know what it's really about. I know what she's working through in her own careful, methodical way. I read the outline and told her it was excellent. She said, "You're not just saying that?" I said, "I never just say things to you, you know that." She thought about it and said, "Yeah, I do know that." That's the thing about trust. When it's broken the right way, when someone earns it through the worst possible circumstances, it's stronger for having been tested. Nora doesn't trust easily, but she trusts me. And I know, in a way I couldn't have articulated before that October, exactly what I am willing to do to keep that trust. They tried to convince her I wasn't coming, that I was too far away, that I wouldn't believe her, that some distances couldn't be crossed. She sent that video anyway. And I came. I think about cause and effect a lot now, not in an abstract way, in the specific, granular way that comes from being a forensic accountant for 15 years. Every number trail has a beginning. Every fraud has a first decision someone made. usually a small one, usually one they talked themselves into. And what I've come to believe, sitting on the other side of what happened to Nora, is that Gwen and Terence didn't become the people who locked a child in a basement overnight. They were always those people. The basement just revealed it. What I did in the weeks after Nora came home, the audit reports, the filings, the letters to their clients, people have asked me if that came from anger. It did, partly. I won't pretend otherwise, but it also came from something colder and more deliberate. It came from knowing that 2 prior families had been paid off or frightened into silence, and that silence had protected Gwen and Terence long enough for them to do it again. To my daughter, the cause of my daughter spending 5 days without adequate food or light in a locked room was not a spilled can of paint. It was years of adults choosing to look away. I was not going to be one of them. There's something I've been trying to teach Nora since she was small. Something I don't think I ever had the right words for until recently. It's the difference between knowing what's right and being willing to act on it when acting costs you something. It's easy to have values in the abstract. It's much harder when using them means confronting someone you're supposed to trust, filing a report that will blow up a family, sitting in a lawyer's office and signing documents that will end someone's livelihood. I did all of those things. I don't regret any of them. And I think, in doing them, I showed Nora something more important than anything I could have said. That integrity is not what you claim to believe. It's what you do when no one is making you. Nora is sharp. She was sharp before this happened, and she is sharper now, in the way that difficult things sometimes sharpen people instead of breaking them. She asks questions about systems, why CPS closed that earlier case, how Terence kept his contractor's license for years while double billing clients, why the first family signed NDAs instead of going to the police. These are not idle questions. She is trying to understand how the world actually works, not how it's supposed to work, and I think that kind of clear-eyed thinking is something worth cultivating in a person. It will protect her. It will protect others too. What I am most proud of, and I say this as someone who is not naturally given to pride, is that she didn't stop trusting people. She became more careful. She became more discerning, but she didn't close herself off. She still has friends she lets in. She still takes chances on people. She sent that video into the dark with no guarantee anyone would see it, because some part of her believed that trying was worth it, even when the outcome wasn't certain. That kind of persistence, the willingness to keep reaching out when you have every reason to give up, is not something you can teach by telling someone to have it. You can only model it. You can only show up every time, until the person watching you starts to believe that showing up is something people actually do. They put her in that room to make her feel small. Instead, she grew up knowing exactly what she's made of. I'd say that's justice. But it's more than that. It's the only real outcome that ever mattered.